The German troops holding Riva Ridge in the northern Apennines had looked at the eastern face of their own position and concluded that nobody could climb it, so they stopped keeping it under regular observation. That was not carelessness. They were experienced troops holding a prepared line, and they had already thrown American attackers off the neighboring summit Mount Belvedere 3 separate times in November and December of 1944. They had earned the right to their own judgment. On the night of 18th February 1945, roughly 700 Americans were on that face in the dark, and they had been ordered not to fire back even if the Germans shot at them. This is the Gothic Line, the belt of fortifications Germany had built across the top of Italy, and by the winter of 1944 it had stopped the Allied advance dead. The problem was geography. The Germans held the high ground above Highway 64, the road into the Po Valley, and from the peaks they could see every approach, and northern Italy opens. Fail, and the campaign sits where it is for another year. Americans had taken Mount Belvedere 3 times. 3 times they had been driven off it by counterattack, because German observers on the ridge next door could see them coming and call artillery onto them with great accuracy. The new divisional commander was Major General George P. Hayes, who had taken over only weeks earlier. Hayes looked at the problem and reached a conclusion his staff had already reached. Belvedere was not the objective. Riva Ridge was. As long as German observers sat on that ridge, every attack on Belvedere would be seen and shot at before it started, and a frontal assault on Riva Ridge, up the approaches the Germans were watching, would be a bloodbath, which left one option, and it was the option the Germans had already dismissed. Go up the face they were not watching. There is only one kind of unit that can be handed that order, and by an accident of American history there was exactly one of them. It had never been in combat, and it had arrived in Italy 3 weeks earlier as the very last of the 63 U.S. Army divisions committed to the European theater. To understand why the United States had such a unit at all and why its men would later change what Americans do on winter weekends, you have to go back to a Colorado Valley and a civilian ski organization that talked the Army into something no civilian organization has managed before or since. In 1940, the United States Army had no mountain troops. It had no doctrine for fighting above the tree line, no winter warfare school, and no particular interest in acquiring either. What changed its mind was watching what happened in Finland, where Finnish ski troops had inflicted severe losses on a far larger Soviet force in terrain the Soviets could not operate in. Somebody in Washington began to wonder what would happen if American soldiers had to fight in the Alps, or the Apennines, or the Aleutians, and concluded that the answer was unpleasant. The man who pushed hardest was not a soldier. Charles Minnow Dole, known as Minnie, was a New York insurance man who had founded the National Ski Patrol after breaking an ankle skiing and discovering that nobody was organized to come and get him. Dole lobbied the War Department relentlessly, and in 1941 he got what he wanted. The Army would raise a mountain unit. And then it agreed to something genuinely unprecedented. The National Ski Patrol would do the recruiting. To this day, it is the only civilian organization ever permitted to recruit for the United States Army. The result was a division unlike any other in the American Army. Applicants needed a letter of recommendation from a ski patrol. What came in were competitive skiers, alpine guides, forestrynians, Ivy League climbers, and a substantial number of European émigrés, Austrians, Swiss, and Norwegians, some of whom had left countries the United States was now fighting. Among them was Torgeir Tokli, a Norwegian who held the American ski jumping record and was widely expected to become the best jumper in the world. They were sent to Camp Hale, Colorado, at 9,200 feet in a valley between the peaks near Leadville, and there they spent 2 years doing something the rest of the Army thought was faintly ridiculous. They skied with 90-pound packs. They climbed rock faces with ropes and pitons. They slept in the snow at altitude to find out what happened to men who slept in the snow at altitude. The rest of the Army called them the ski troops, and did not mean it kindly, and for 2 years the joke held up, because they never went anywhere. Divisions raised after them, shipped out ahead of them. Subscribe before the next chapter, because the strangest detail of this whole operation is coming, and it is about what the Germans failed to notice for over a week. Stay with me, because through January and early February 1945, climbers from the 86th Regiment went out onto the eastern face of Riva Ridge and in darkness, working out where a man carrying a rifle could get up it. They found 5 routes. They installed ropes, pitons and anchors on the hardest sections, so the assault could move fast when it came. That work took over a week on an exposed rock face, and the Germans above them never saw it. The plan was called Operation Encore, and it was built entirely on surprise, which meant it was built entirely on a list of things the assault force was forbidden to do. The first was artillery. There would be no preparatory bombardment before the climb, none at all, because a barrage on Riva Ridge would tell every German in the sector exactly where the attack was coming. Infantry going up a cliff without artillery support is not how the US Army fought this war. It is close to the opposite of how the US Army fought this war. The second was noise. The climb would be made in silence above a whisper, nothing metal allowed to swing loose. The third followed from the second, and is the one that is hard to sit with. If the Germans engaged them on the way up, they were not to return fire. A single muzzle flash on that face would show the enemy precisely where 700 men were hanging on a rope in the dark, so the order was to take it and keep climbing. According to the US Army's own account of the operation, during the night ascent, the soldiers never returned fire when Germans attempted to engage them. The fourth constraint was not an order, it was an absurdity. The specialized equipment this division had spent 2 years developing and testing at Camp Hale. The gear designed for exactly this was still back in the United States. The men who were about to climb a 2,000-foot winter cliff in the dark were doing it with what they happened to have with them. And there was a fifth problem nobody had ordered either. The routes were narrow enough that the battalion had to go up in single file, which meant that if they were discovered, halfway there was no room to deploy, no room to fight, and nowhere to go. 1930 hours, 18 February 1945, roughly 700 men of the 1st Battalion, 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment, reinforced by F Company from the 2nd Battalion, started up 4 of the 5 routes carrying weapons, ammunition, climbing gear, and rations. Sources give the height of that climb as anywhere between 1,500 and 2,000 feet, depending on which route you measure, and I have spent a while trying to reconcile them, rather than pick the most impressive number. If that is the kind of history you want more of, hit like, nothing else. Then, partway up, the weather did them a favor. Fog came in, it rolled up the valley and settled over the face, and it hid them. Veterans who were on that climb remembered 2 things afterward. One was the fog. The other was that there were 5 or 6 medics with the battalion instead of the usual one, and the men could count. They knew what that meant about the odds somebody in headquarters had put on this. They kept going anyway, in single file, in silence, in the dark, on a rock face in February, with orders not to shoot. They reached the top shortly before dawn on the 19th February. That is the halfway point of this story, and not one shot has been fired, and then the silence ended. The positions on the summit were taken fast, and most of the German garrison was still in its dugouts when the Americans came over the crest. The ridge changed hands in minutes. On the climb itself, the part everybody remembers, the battalion suffered no deaths and by one account a single man wounded. 700 soldiers went up a cliff the enemy had written off as impossible and took the objective at a cost that rounds to nothing. That is where most retellings of this story stop. It is not where the story stops. Taking ground is the easy half. The Germans understood exactly what the loss of that ridge meant for the whole sector, and they came back for it, repeatedly, for 5 days. The Americans on the summit were now the ones on exposed high ground, with a supply line running down a cliff face. Everything they needed had to come up that face on a man's back, and every casualty had to go down it the same way, which took about 3 hours, and which nobody could sustain, so the engineers solved it. and the solution is one of the best pieces of improvisation in the Italian campaign. The hardest fighting was on the far eastern spur, a rock knob called Piso di Campiano, where Lieutenant James Luce and about a dozen men from A Company held a position that the Germans wanted back more than anything else on the ridge. Counterattacks came in against a handful of Americans on a summit they had reached by rope a few hours earlier, with no artillery preparation of their own, resupplied by whatever could be carried up a cliff. They held. Over those 5 days on Riva Ridge, 17 Americans were killed and 51 were wounded, every one of them after the climb, not during it. The engineering solution was an aerial tramway. The 126th Engineer Mountain Battalion built a cable system roughly 1,800 feet long, running from the valley floor to the ridge, and it changed the arithmetic of the whole position. Ammunition and rations went up it. Wounded men came down it. The evacuation time for a casualty went from about 3 hours, carried by hand down a cliff, to about 5 minutes. Almost nobody outside the 10th Mountain Division has ever heard of that tramway, and it is the reason the ridge was held. 24 hours after the climb, the main event began. On the night of 19th February, 6 additional infantry battalions, the 85th, the 87th, and the rest of the 86th, some 13,000 deer and its neighbouring summits, again without an artillery preparation, supported by soldiers of the 1st Brazilian Division of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. This time the German observers on Riva Ridge were not there to see them coming. That was the entire point of everything in the previous chapter. Belvedere was not cheap. The Germans were alert, the wire was mined, and the advance went uphill for 6 days in the face of machine gun and mortar fire, with parachute flares turning the night white over men caught in the open. Allied casualties in that attack came to 923, 92 killed, 730 wounded, 1 taken prisoner, but the peaks fell, one after another: Belvedere, Gorgolesco, della Torraccia. The line that had held since the previous autumn was broken, and the road into the Po Valley was open. Torger Tokley held the American ski jumping record and was expected to become the best jumper in the world. He was killed on the 3rd of March 1945, 2 weeks after Riva Ridge, at the age of 25, and whatever he would have done with the next 40 years did not happen. The 10th Mountain Division spent less than 4 months in combat. Of roughly 20,000 men who served in it in Italy, close to 1,000 were killed, a casualty rate among the highest in the US Army. On the 30th of April 1945, 8 days before the end of the war in Europe, a landing craft carrying its soldiers across Lake Garda capsized and drowned 25 of them. Now the part the title promised. The men who came home from that division came home with 2 things: a set of skills the United States had almost no civilian use for, and a very specific memory of what mountains in winter were like when somebody was not shooting at you. So they went back to the mountains. 10 mountain veterans founded, built, managed, or taught at more than 60 ski areas across the United States. Roughly 2,000 of them became ski instructors. The American ski industry, as it exists today, was substantially constructed by men who learned the mountains in order to fight in them. Pete Seibert served in the 86th Mountain Infantry, was severely wounded in the fighting around 1945, and was told he would not walk normally again. He did. In 1962, he opened a ski area in a Colorado valley that had nothing in it, and he called it Vail. Friedel Pfeiffer, an Austrian who had been interned as an enemy alien before joining the division, went to a decaying Colorado silver town and turned it into Aspen. Camp Hale, where they all trained, is now a national monument, and the 10th Mountain Division still exists at Fort Drum in New York. There is an honest footnote in 3 parts, and the first one is about this video's own title. It compresses. The 700 men who climbed Riva Ridge and the veterans who built the ski industry overlap, but they are not the same 700. Seibert was in the 86th and was hit on Belvedere, not on the ridge. Second, the height of that cliff is reported as 15,500, 15,600, 700 and 2,000 feet in reputable sources, and which is right depends on which of the 5 routes you measure. Third, the popular version says they took the ridge without losses. They took it that way. Holding it for 5 days cost 17 dead, and those men get dropped from the story by the phrasing. Every February, soldiers still climb that face. On the 80th anniversary in February 2025, American troops went up Riva Ridge again in the dark alongside Italian mountain troops and stood on the summit where the 1945 battalions stood. The German assessment of that face was not stupid. It was correct about almost everybody in the world. It was wrong about the roughly 700 men who had spent 2 years in a Colorado valley being laughed at. If your family had somebody in the 10th Mountain or in the Italian campaign at all, Anzio, Cassino, the Gothic Line, the Po Valley, put them in the comments. Italy is the theatre Americans forget. Tell us one thing about them beyond the unit. Tell us one thing about them beyond the unit. Something they said, something they kept, something they did afterward. Subscribe, and we will keep going up the faces nobody is looking at.